Hello again, listeners, and welcome to another Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Chris, today we are doing cyborgs,
Yes.
inspired, of course, by our last episode on Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And I have a quote from the Terminator franchise here defining what a cyborg is.
Right.
A cyborg is a cybernetic organism, living tissue over a metal endoskeleton. So that'll do, won't it? We don't need to do the rest of the footnote.
Absolutely, and I think that's put it better than I ever could. No, I think there's lots of interesting things to say about the cyborg, and both the idea of a cyborg, and also I think the second part to this is how the cyborg has been used within, I guess, cultural studies as a kind of symbol, a sort of a metaphor for other ways of thinking about identity, and then also with the advent of computer technology within cinema, the cyborg's often used as a kind of, a metaphor or a way of talking about a hybrid cinema that is between photography and kind of digital technology. So when you are ready to start the timer, I will be ready to chat.
Well, sounds like we've got three things to talk about then. So I'll start the timer. Let's start with the tropics itself.
Okay.
That definition aside, what is a cyborg for everyone? Can we come up with a definition of it and give us some examples of them?
Okay, so I think the cyborg, generally speaking, is about that kind of fluency and fluidity, or the interconnectedness between humans and technology. The idea that technology is in some form a continuation of biology. Now, of course, there are real-world cyborgs. If we think about medical procedures, prosthetics, armatures, pacemakers, obviously, discourses certainly in the 90s around cloning. There's been writing on kind of organ donation, frozen embryos, assisted procreation. There are many ways in which there has been or there has been made visible the integration of a kind of quote-unquote artificial component or technology into the human. Now, of course, these real-world ideas of the human or these real-world ideas of the cyborg that play with that master-slave narrative that we have with technology. What would happen if technology kind of took over and became the master and we became the slaves? A lot of these films from Terminator to Metropolis are about perhaps the enslavement of humanity. But people that are writing on the cyborg, I think, at once talk about the cyborg on film, let's say, or within popular media, from Metropolis right up to a film we've done on the podcast, Ex Machina. This idea that cyborg protagonists, the figure of the cyborg, these part human, part machine figurations, kind of transgress the boundaries between the artificial and the organic, and then in doing so, that in and of itself provokes a debate around the human, the idea of the humanity. What would it mean what would it mean to think about a human and technology in these kind of interconnected ways, but also what does it mean maybe to think of us as all in some ways connected to our phones and our, we are all post-human in lots and lots of ways. So I guess the cyborg is this sort of symbolic, this figure of fascination that broaches those boundaries between two things that we normally hold distinct. And it's really about kind of subverting the hierarchies. Right. So that's, I think, the figure of the cyborg.
So we can have cyborgs like the Terminator that's a figure of horror. We can have cyborgs like RoboCop that's a figure of spectacle. We can have cyborgs like, is it Ava in Ex Machina, who's a sort of a figure
erotic,
of erotic function, but also a kind of looking into it and seeing the human in the non-human, all these kind of fun things. So that's what they do on screen. You teased us in your introduction that they have been used in not necessarily film theory, but theories of culture, theories of kind of identity in interesting ways. So how can we think of ourselves as cyborgs, and why would we think of ourselves as cyborgs? What's the use of doing that?
Yeah, so a part of if we think about the cyborg as this figure of fascination, that leads into us discussing the cyborg in terms of its metaphorical or symbolic function. It's a symbolic other. It is not quite human, and it is not quite machine. It is that sort of ambivalent kind of liminal identity. It's caught between two modes of existence. So as a result of that, the cyborg has become the locus for a number of debates within cultural studies around race and gender, and I guess more recently, kind of sexuality. This comes from, and we had a little chat about this before we started, Donna J. Haraway, writing Cyborg Manifesto, went through various iterations, but recently has appeared in a book on the gendered cyborg from 2000, where Donna Haraway says, and this is a quote that I use in my classes, a cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, and this is crucial, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. So it is a creature that exists in fiction, in science fiction, as a way to perhaps meditate on the nature of the human or the rise of technology, or to quote the subtitle of the third Terminator film, The Rise of the Machines. But it's also a creature of social reality. It's not the preserve of fiction. So therefore we start thinking about, okay, so how might the cyborg be used to negotiate kind of queer, bodies that exist in a liminal space. So if we think of the cyborg, that is often attributed to or placed within a narrative of resistance, of rebellion, of transformation, of fantasy, and all of these things lend itself to a discussion of certain kinds of gender, certain kinds of sexuality.
Just unpack that a little bit more for me, just in case the listener's sort of not following. So
sure.
So Just do that. If anyone's going there, hang on, what do you mean it's a social reality? Aren't we talking about Terminators and robots here?
Sure.
Give us just a few more examples of why it's a social reality, and then we can unpack, once we accept that, what that means.
So on the one hand, we must accept that to some extent, cyborgs exist within the realm of fantasy fiction, of science fiction, but it can also be used as a metaphor to think about real-world bodies that are caught between different identities, that bodies that have to fight, bodies that resist. So it's kind of used almost metaphorically or symbolically for us to, if we think about what the connotations of a cyborg are, if we think about the struggles of a cyborg caught between these two identities, that gets us thinking about real-world bodies, real-world kind of, I hate to use this phrase, but kind of types of demographics that are enslaved, that are marginalised, that are that need to resist and rebel against their own kind of metaphorical, quote-unquote, and real-life kind of enslavement. So Haraway's thinking, if we're all cyborgs, we need to think about queer bodies, who move through a world that isn't quite built for them. People that are writing, Leilani Mishami has written an article about the mulatto cyborg, the idea that the cyborg inhabits some of the values of experience that mixed race bodies experience, being caught between two different kinds of identities. Those kinds of microaggressions. Where are you really from? What are you really? What are you again? These kinds of questions that envelop mixed race bodies are usefully sort of cyborgian in the way that the cyborg at least gets us thinking about hybrid, kind of non-normative, liminal, uncanny, politicized bodies, and how the cyborg can be used in that kind of metaphorical way.
So just as fictional cyborgs could be read as metaphors for these things, right? So we could read, let's use the Terminator's example, as a metaphor for human identity. We talked on the last podcast about, some of the clunky ways in which Terminator 2 thinks about ideas of fatherhood, but also kind of, masculinity, and the way it kind of uses the cyborg as a metaphor to explore these ideas. We can then kind of turn it back on itself and use the metaphor to kind of talk about our own identity and illuminate some things about things that are that might not have literal reality but have figurative purchase and reality. And
Haraway says the cyborg is not just reserved for science fiction. It is, she says, the cyborg is our ontology. It gives us our politics. One doesn't have to look very far to think of bodies that are liminal, that are kind of mixed in the sense of multiraciality or mixed race identity or queer bodies or trans studies. Sure. I think it's significant that Haraway at the time that she's writing Cyborg Manifesto, her PhD student is Sandy Stone, who is the founder of essentially transgender studies. So thinking about bodies that are ambivalent, that cause disruption to the normative. That's really what the cyborg is, a figure of disruption.
And then finally, with a minute or two to talk about this bit, you also suggested that we've now brought the cyborg metaphor to talk about bodies and human identity. Mm-hmm. You can also use it to talk about cinema and the digital, and you gestured towards how we might think of that in a cyborgian way.
Yeah, so a number of writers writing on special effects in cinema talk of it in terms of this hybridization between photography and digital technology, and the way in which these two identities are competing in the construction of certain kinds of audiovisual images. So people writing, for example, on the digitally assisted long take, so films in which there are virtual cameras or digital technology used to stitch together multiple scenes and sequences. Basically, photographic cinema, or what we would understand as live action cinema, is increasingly kind of corrupted through its augmentation, maybe, with technology, which is sort of seen symbolically as contemporary Hollywood cinema is highly cyborgian in the way it negotiates two competing identities at once.
I'm thinking, actually, and this is just me riffing, but I've been thinking quite a little bit about that. The Bazin essay, The Ontology of the Photographic Image. There's a footnote. Yes. We should do that sometime. But about his sort of discussion of the non-human and cinema as a kind of injecting an element of the non-human into the world, and so it's humans using non-human technology to express themselves. So it sounds like there's a way in which the cyborg can be both in cinema, it can be cinema, and it can be all of us in many ways, shapes or forms.
Yes, it is, and I think this is going back to that kind of key quote from Harroway, that it is not the idea of the cyborg and the notion of something that's post-human is no longer the reserve of science fiction. It gives us our politics, but it also gives us a way to talk about what was previously analog cinema, which is often there to represent, I guess, a human point of view, as Will Brown would say. It's increasingly being modified and hybridized through these sort of technological processes. It is no longer purely organic / photographic. It is mechanized, and it at least gives us a way of thinking about hybridity in cinema.
Right, we're out of time, so give us a few of the books you've mentioned, just so people can go and find them easily if they wish to.
Okay, so I would suggest anything by Donna Haraway. So Cyborg Manifesto, that was published basically as a way to think about socialist feminism in the 1980s, and I'd also add to that an article that I referenced, Leilani Nishimi's The Mulatto Cyborg: Imagining a Multiracial Future, which is from 2005, which again, like so many of these canonical figures, people like Haraway's work has been adapted and sort of worked with, offered counter readings of, to think about different kinds of hybrid identities and the kind of peculiarity of outsiderdom and marginality and so forth, figures that are considered both more than and less than human. So Haraway, Nishimi's The Mulatto Cyborg.
Terrific. That was 10 minutes or so on cyborgs. If you have a suggestion for another Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast, and we need them, everyone, because full disclosure, Chris and I recorded a different episode for this today, and then realised once we recorded that we'd already recorded a Footnote on this. So it's happened. We're finally repeating ourselves.
Yes.
Listeners may suggest we've been repeating ourselves since the first episode, but that's fine. It's all about animation. It's all about animation and the Wizard of Oz, isn't it? But yeah, do send your suggestions in at research, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Help us out of our funk and give us your own suggestions of what we should be talking about on these episodes. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye.